Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of rural Vermont. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1920, and Oakvale, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont, was draped in the aftermath of both a world war and a devastating pandemic. Most residents had lost someone to battle, to illness, or to the mass exodus that followed economic hardship. This is where our story begins, not with screams or violence, but with silence. The peculiar silence that surrounded the Montgomery Funeral Home, standing at the edge of town like a sentinel between the living and the dead. Sutton and Vivian Montgomery were not originally from Oakvale. They arrived in the spring of 1919, purchasing the town's only funeral parlor from the aging Wilbur Harrison, who had buried 3 generations of Oakvale residents. The Montgomerys came with impeccable references, proper licenses, and the sort of somber dignity one expects from those who prepare the dead. Sutton was tall, gaunt, with hands that seemed too large for his wiry frame. Vivian was his opposite, petite with unnervingly steady hands and eyes that, according to town records, never seemed to blink when they should. The Montgomery Funeral Home stood on Willow Street, a Victorian structure with dark green shutters and a peculiar architectural quirk. The building had been constructed with the basement partially visible from street level, like a house reluctant to fully emerge from the earth. This was where the preparation room was located, its small rectangular windows at ground level, always covered with thick curtains regardless of the season. The couple lived on the upper floor, conducted viewings on the main level, and worked their craft below ground. It was a sensible arrangement, common for the profession. What wasn't common, according to statements later collected by the Oakvale Historical Society, was how quickly the Montgomerys integrated themselves into the community despite maintaining an air of polite detachment. They were present but never quite there, recalled Josephine Merritt in a 1958 oral history recording preserved at the Vermont State Archives. They'd attend every community function but speak only when spoken to. They'd make eye contact but seem to be looking at something just beyond you. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just off. The first unusual detail about the Montgomerys surfaced in tax records from 1919. Their business was immediately successful, unusually so for newcomers in a small town where families typically used the same funeral services for generations. Within 6 months, the Montgomerys had conducted more funerals than Harrison had in his final 2 years of operation. Records show they charged less than the regional average, yet their income exceeded expectations. The town clerk noted in her personal diary, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1962, that the funeral home ordered unusual quantities of preservation chemicals, enough for twice the number of deceased they processed. Perhaps most notably, the Montgomerys had a peculiar professional method that initially went unremarked upon, then became a subject of muted discussion, and finally was accepted as their signature practice. They took photographs of the deceased, not just standard memorial photographs, common in that era, but multiple photographs at different stages of their preparation process. It was for the families, Sutton would explain in his formal, measured manner, a record of our care for their loved ones. Yet according to 3 separate accounts, these photographs were rarely shared with relatives. When pressed about this discrepancy, Vivian would smile her tight smile and explain that most families found additional images too difficult to bear, but that maintaining them was essential to their professional standards. The first true disturbance in the steady rhythm of the Montgomerys' business came in August of 1920. A sudden summer storm had caused the collapse of the old mill roof, resulting in the death of Ezekiel Palmer, a respected farmer whose family had lived in Oakvale since its founding. His body, crushed beyond recognition, presented a formidable challenge even to the most skilled morticians. According to the account of Dr. Augustus Reynolds, the town physician who pronounced Palmer dead at the scene, Sutton Montgomery displayed an unusual reaction when viewing the remains. "I have seen many men face death in medical school and in practice," Dr. Reynolds wrote in a letter to his brother in Boston, uncovered decades later. "Undertakers typically maintain a professional distance, not cold, but measured. Montgomery didn't flinch at the gruesome sight, which is expected. What was unexpected was the look that passed between him and his wife. It wasn't sorrow or shock or even professional assessment. It was anticipation." For 3 days, the lights in the basement of the Montgomery Funeral Home burned through the night. Deliveries of ice were made twice daily, unusual given the cooling systems they'd recently installed. The town telephone operator, Mabel Duncan, reported overhearing fragments of an unusual number of long-distance calls placed by Vivian to medical supply companies in Boston and New York. When Palmer's closed casket funeral was held the following weekend, something remarkable happened that would later be cited in multiple accounts as the moment when perceptions of the Montgomerys began to shift. They had accomplished what many considered impossible, presenting Palmer's ruined face as peaceful and whole. The reconstruction was so masterful that Palmer's widow insisted on an open casket after all, against the Montgomerys' surprising recommendation to keep it closed. "He looks like he's just sleeping," Palmer's sister was reported to have said, her voice carrying across the hushed parlor. "How did you do this? It's a miracle." The miracle, however, did not extend to the rest of the body, which remained covered. And Ezekiel's widow, upon kissing her husband's forehead in farewell, would later tell her sister something troubling. His skin didn't feel right, not like flesh at all. It was shortly after the Palmer funeral that Oakvale residents began to notice a change in the Montgomerys' demeanor. The polite distance they had maintained gave way to a subtle confidence that bordered on satisfaction. They began hosting small gatherings at the funeral home, ostensibly community outreach, though invitations were selective and often extended to the town's most prominent citizens, or those who had recently experienced a loss in the family. During these intimate soirees, held in the formal parlor where the dead were typically displayed, guests were served tea in delicate china cups while Sutton would hold forth on topics ranging from modern embalming techniques to ancient Egyptian preservation methods. Vivian, meanwhile, would circulate with a silver tray of small, precisely cut sandwiches, her movements fluid and economical. "The conversations always circled back to death," recalled Harriet Pembroke, who attended one such gathering in September 1920 following the passing of her father. Not in a morbid way, but with an artist's appreciation for the process. Sutton once described preservation as capturing a moment forever in the same reverent tone my husband uses when discussing photography. The photography comparison was more apt than Pembroke realized. According to inventory records discovered in 1963, the Montgomerys had accumulated an impressive array of photographic equipment: cameras, specialized lenses, lighting apparatus, and darkroom chemicals in quantities, suggesting a serious studio operation rather than mere memorial portraiture. The Montgomerys' professional reputation continued to grow throughout the autumn of 1920. Their services were increasingly sought after, not just in Oakvale, but in neighboring communities as well. They hired an assistant, Percival Jenkins, a quiet man with a medical background who had been unable to complete his physician training due to the war. Jenkins lived in a small apartment above the carriage house behind the funeral home and was known to work unusual hours. Jenkins would later become a critical witness, though his statements, given to the Oakvale sheriff in late December 1920, were initially dismissed as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. It was only when physical evidence emerged that his account gained credibility. According to the sheriff's report, Filed but subsequently removed from official records, a copy was discovered in the personal effects of Deputy Walter Crane in 1955. Jenkins approached authorities after witnessing what he described as unnatural practices in the preparation room. "They don't just preserve them," Jenkins reportedly stated. "They transform them, change them in ways that aren't right. And the photographs aren't for records, they're trophies, evidence of their work." What Jenkins described next was so disturbing that Sheriff Martin Sullivan reportedly ordered the deputy to strike it from the official record. The existing document contains only a vague reference to manipulation of the deceased beyond professional necessity and creation of permanent art pieces through specialized chemical treatments. The turning point came on December 10, 1920, when the Montgomerys received the body of Matilda Grayson, an elderly widow who had passed peacefully in her sleep. Her nephew, Herbert Grayson, a bank manager in Burlington who had returned to arrange her affairs, made a specific request. As Matilda had always been proud of her hands, she had been an accomplished pianist. He wanted a photograph of them to remember her by. Sutton Montgomery politely declined, explaining that they only photographed the face for memorial purposes. When Grayson insisted, even offering additional payment, the Undertaker became uncharacteristically flustered. According to Grayson's subsequent statement, Vivian intervened smoothly, offering to take a simple photograph of Matilda's face instead, free of charge. Unsatisfied and increasingly suspicious, Grayson returned to the funeral home after hours. The details of what happened next come from his sworn testimony given from a hospital bed on December 11th. Grayson described entering through an unlocked side door and making his way to the basement preparation room, expecting to find his aunt's body being readied for the funeral scheduled for the following day. What he found instead would launch an investigation that exposed the true nature of the Montgomerys' operation. The preparation room was illuminated not by the usual clinical lights, but by photography lamps arranged in an artistic configuration. Matilda Grayson's body lay on the central table, but she had been positioned in a manner Grayson described as theatrical, seated upright with the help of hidden supports, her head tilted at a graceful angle, her expression altered to one of serene contemplation. Most disturbing of all, her hands, the very feature her nephew had wanted to memorialize, had been modified. According to Grayson's testimony, they were no longer my aunt's hands. The fingers had been elongated somehow, made more elegant, more expressive. They didn't look human anymore. The walls of the room, normally bare, had been transformed for the photography session. Dark fabric draped the background, creating what Grayson recognized from his own amateur photography interest as a portrait studio setting. But what caused him to flee in horror, alerting neighbors who then contacted the sheriff, was what he glimpsed in a partially open cabinet near the darkroom door. Dozens of photograph albums, each meticulously labeled with names and dates. The sheriff's raid on the Montgomery funeral home in the pre-dawn hours of December 12, 1920, revealed the full scope of the couple's activities. The official report, heavily redacted before being filed with the county clerk, documented the discovery of over 20 albums containing photographs that chronicled the Montgomerys' work since their arrival in Oakville. Each album told the story of a transformation from recently deceased to what the Montgomerys referred to in their private notes as the perfected form. The photographs revealed a disturbing progression. Initial images showed the subjects as they arrived at the funeral home, natural in death, with all the expected signs of life's end. Subsequent images documented stages of the Montgomerys' work, structural alterations to facial features, chemical treatments that changed the quality of the skin, positioning techniques that created unnatural but aesthetically striking poses. The final photographs in each series showed the completed works, the dead transformed into idealized versions of themselves, with expressions and physical characteristics that had never been theirs in life. These final images were printed larger than the others and mounted on heavy cardstock with gold edging. Most horrifying of all was the discovery in the sub-basement, a space not on any official building plans, accessed through a hidden door in the floor of the main preparation room. Here, in a climate-controlled chamber lined with glass-fronted cabinets, the Montgomerys had kept select specimens from their 2 years of operation. Through a proprietary preservation technique combining traditional embalming with chemical treatments derived from taxidermy and museum conservation methods, they had created what amounted to human sculptures, permanent, physically altered remains of select individuals whose transformations they had deemed most successful. According to the coroner who examined these remains, his full report was sealed by court order until 1960, the bodies had been subjected to a process that replaced much of their tissue with a substance that maintained form but altered texture, explaining why Ezekiel Palmer's widow had noted that his skin didn't feel right. The Montgomerys were arrested at a train station in White River Junction, apparently in the process of fleeing to Canada. They offered no resistance and, according to the arresting officers, displayed the same calm demeanor they were known for in Oakville. Their only request was to be allowed to bring a leather-bound book which was seized as evidence and later identified as a journal detailing their techniques and philosophy. The journal, excerpts of which were read at their closed trial, revealed the disturbing mindset behind their actions. The Montgomerys viewed themselves not as undertakers but as artists working in a medium others were afraid to explore. They believed they were liberating the dead from the poor design choices of nature and the ravages of life, creating permanent art that captured human beauty in its most perfect form. "The dead are our canvas," Sutton wrote in an entry dated April 1919. "Their families surrender them to us, believing we merely delay the inevitable decay for a few days of viewing. They don't understand that we offer something far greater, true permanence, true perfection. We free our subjects from the flawed vessels they inhabited and grant them the ideal forms they deserved." What made the Montgomerys particularly disturbing to those who studied their case was their complete lack of remorse or awareness that what they had done was wrong. Throughout their trial, they maintained the calm, professional demeanor that had initially endeared them to Oakville residents. They spoke of their art with the pride of accomplished craftspeople, seemingly genuinely confused by society's horror at their work. "We improved them," Vivian stated during one of the few moments when she addressed the court directly. "We gave them beauty and permanence. In life they were ordinary. In our hands they became extraordinary. Is that not what art should do?" This disconnect from normal human empathy fascinated Dr. Lucius Harmon, a psychiatrist who evaluated both Montgomerys before their sentencing. In his confidential report, sealed until 1966, then partially released to the Vermont Medical Journal, he described them as exhibiting a profound perversion of the aesthetic sense coupled with an almost complete absence of normal moral constraints. They view the human body not as something sacred or as the vessel of a person's identity, Dr. Harmon wrote, but as raw material, clay to be molded, marble to be sculpted. In their minds, they have not desecrated the dead, but elevated them. This represents a fundamental break with the moral framework that governs how we treat human remains in civilized society. The Montgomerys' trial was brief and held largely out of public view. The judge, citing the unprecedented and morally abhorrent nature of the crimes, ordered all testimony and evidence sealed for 40 years. The couple was found guilty of multiple counts of desecration of human remains and fraud upon the bereaved. They were sentenced to life imprisonment at separate facilities, Sutton at Vermont State Prison and Vivian at the Vermont State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. What happened to the Montgomerys after their incarceration has been pieced together from various institutional records and accounts from prison staff. Sutton, by all accounts, was a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, and solitary. He requested and received permission to work in the prison library, where he developed an expertise in art history and anatomy. His prison notebooks, discovered after his death and now held in the sealed archives of the Vermont Historical Society, reveal that his obsession with perfecting the human form never waned. These notebooks contain hundreds of detailed sketches, anatomical studies, facial reconstructions, and designs for what he called improvements to the human form. In the margins, he wrote commentaries on classical sculptures, often critiquing the ancient masters for their timidity in adhering too closely to natural human proportions. Michelangelo understood his artstom. His figures strain against the limitations of mere humanity, but even he was constrained by the living. We who work with the dead have no such constraints. The dead do not protest when we perfect them. Vivian's institutional experience differed markedly from her husband's. Initially diagnosed with moral insanity, a term used in the early 20th century to describe individuals who understood social norms but felt no compulsion to follow them, she was subjected to various experimental treatments common in that era. Records indicate she received hydrotherapy, electroshock treatments, and various pharmaceutical interventions, none of which appeared to alter her fundamental perspective on her actions. What is particularly notable about Vivian's time at the Vermont State Hospital was her influence on the staff. Nurse Abigail Winters, who worked on Vivian's ward from 1927 to 1936, left behind a series of private letters to her sister, discovered among her effects after her death in 1968, that documented a disturbing pattern. Mrs. Montgomery has a way of speaking about beauty that makes you forget, just for a moment, what she did, Nurse Winters wrote in 1931. She talks about the human form as if she's seeing something the rest of us can't, possibilities beyond what nature intended. Sometimes, after our conversations, I find myself looking at people differently, noticing the imperfections she's trained me to see. More troubling was Winters' confession in a letter dated 1935 that she had begun bringing Vivian photographs from medical textbooks and art books smuggled from the hospital library. She critiques them like a professor reviewing a student's work, Winters wrote. I know I shouldn't, but there's something mesmerizing about her perspective. She sees flaws and possibilities that never occurred to me. The Montgomery Funeral Home was permanently closed following the couple's arrest. The building remained empty for several years before being purchased by the town and demolished in 1926. A small park now occupies the location, though older residents still refer to it as Montgomery Green, despite its official designation as Willow Street Park. According to local historian Eustace Bennett, writing in the Oakville Gazette in 1955, the decision to convert the property into a park rather than sell it for commercial development stemmed from a deep-seated fear that something of the Montgomery's dark energy might linger in the structure itself. The demolition was reportedly thorough, with the basement and sub-basement completely excavated and filled with concrete before the landscaping was completed. The full collection of photographs in Sutton's journal were ordered destroyed by the court, but rumors persisted that certain officials had preserved these items for their historical significance or out of morbid curiosity. These rumors appeared to be confirmed in 1964 when an attic renovation in the former home of Judge Hiram Coolidge, who had presided over the Montgomery trial, revealed a hidden compartment containing a small leather case. Inside were 12 photographs from the Montgomerys' collection, the finished portraits of their first victims in Oakville, along with several pages apparently torn from Sutton's journal. These items were briefly held by the Vermont Historical Society before being sealed again by court order. Their current whereabouts are unknown to the public. What these preserved photographs revealed According to Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who examined them briefly during their time at the Historical Society, was the true extent of the Montgomerys' technical skill and artistic vision, however perverted that vision might be. These were not the crude modifications of amateur taxidermists or the ghoulish trophies of deranged minds. Dr. Simmons wrote in her sealed report, portions of which were leaked to the Journal of Forensic Photography in 1965. These were the works of individuals with profound technical knowledge of human anatomy, chemistry, and visual composition. The subjects had been transformed in ways that were simultaneously beautiful and profoundly disturbing, like classical sculptures brought to life, or rather, to a state beyond life. The photographs, according to Dr. Simmons's description, showed subjects posed in ways reminiscent of classical art, positions that would be impossible for living humans to maintain. Their features had been subtly altered, cheekbones heightened, jawlines refined, eyes seemingly enlarged and given an unnatural luminosity through chemical treatment of the surrounding tissue. Most disturbing were the expressions, serene yet alert, with a quality that Dr. Simmons described as an awareness that transcends death. The Montgomerys' case eventually faded from public memory, relegated to occasional mentions in academic studies of criminal psychology or specialized books on New England's darkest histories. Yet in certain circles, particularly among students of mortuary science and collectors of Macabre Americana, the Undertaker artists remained subjects of morbid fascination. Perhaps the most disturbing postscript to the Montgomery case emerged in 1959, when Vivian Montgomery, then in her 70s and still institutionalized, granted her only interview to Dr. Malcolm Hargrove, a psychiatrist researching notorious criminal cases. The transcript, released after her death in 1961, contains a chilling exchange that suggests the Montgomerys' work extended beyond what was discovered in Oakvale. "You must understand," Vivian told Dr. Hargrove, "Oakvale was merely our latest gallery. There were others before, and there would have been more after. Art requires an audience, doctor, but also discretion. We simply became incautious in our enthusiasm for the remarkable material Vermont provided us." When asked how many galleries had existed before Oakvale, Vivian reportedly smiled her characteristic tight smile and replied, "Enough to fill a museum, and they're still out there, you know, perfect and unchanged, waiting to be appreciated by someone with the vision to understand what we accomplished." Investigators followed this lead, examining the Montgomerys' movements prior to their arrival in Vermont. Records show they had operated funeral homes under various names in 4 other small towns across New England between 1912 and 1918. Each business had been sold or abruptly closed before their move to the next location. Authorities in these communities conducted searches of the former Montgomery properties, but no additional specimens were ever officially discovered. However, in 1965, an anonymous letter was sent to the Boston Globe, claiming that a hidden room had been found during renovations of a former funeral home in New Hampshire, containing preserved remains unlike anything in nature. The letter, which was never authenticated, included a detailed description that matched the Montgomerys' known methods. The newspaper chose not to publish the story, and official records show no investigation was conducted. This pattern of official reluctance to pursue potential Montgomery sites beyond Oakvale has led some researchers to speculate about a deliberate suppression of information. Dr. Martin Cahill, writing in the Journal of Criminal Psychology in 1967, suggested that authorities may have deemed it less damaging to public morale to allow the Montgomerys' earlier works to remain undiscovered than to reveal the full scope of their activities across multiple communities. Sutton Montgomery died in prison in 1943 at the age of 61. According to the prison physician's report, his health had been declining for several years, though he remained mentally acute until the end. His last request, denied by prison authorities, was to be allowed to prepare his own body for burial according to his artistic principles. Instead, Following a court order issued years earlier in anticipation of his eventual death, his remains were cremated to ensure they could not become the subject of preservation or display. Vivian outlived her husband by nearly 2 decades, dying at the Vermont State Hospital in 1961 at the age of 79. By then, she had become something of an institution within the institution, a living artifact of a notorious case, occasionally trotted out for visiting psychiatrists or criminologists interested in studying her unique pathology. According to hospital records, Vivian remained intellectually sharp and aesthetically opinionated until her final days. She developed a hobby of critiquing the appearance of hospital staff and fellow patients, making unsolicited suggestions for how they might improve their features through various modifications. These suggestions were recorded by fascinated staff members, creating what Dr. Hargrove called a disturbing catalog of potential human alterations. In her final year, Vivian began creating detailed drawings of what she called her ideal forms, human figures modified in ways that pushed the boundaries of anatomical possibility. These drawings, preserved in the hospital's archives but never publicly displayed, show human bodies elongated and contorted into elegant but impossible positions, with facial features refined beyond natural human limits. Dr. Hargrove, in his final assessment of Vivian Montgomery, wrote, "She represents a unique type of criminal mind, one that has subordinated all moral considerations to a twisted aesthetic vision. In her world, beauty is not merely subjective, but objective, and she believes she has discovered its perfect form. That this form requires the violation of our most sacred taboos concerning the treatment of the dead is, to her, merely an unfortunate social constraint to be overcome by true artists." What remains undisputed is the effect the Montgomerys had on funeral practices in Vermont and surrounding states. In the aftermath of the case, new regulations were implemented requiring strict documentation of all procedures performed on the deceased. Family members were given the legal right to be present during preparations if they wished, and photography of the dead became subject to explicit written consent, with clear limitations on how such images could be used. The most poignant reminder of the case's impact can be found in the Oakvale Cemetery. In the far corner, separated from the main burial grounds by a low stone wall, lies a section dedicated to those who passed through the Montgomery Funeral Home. After the couple's crimes were discovered, many families chose to exhume and rebury their loved ones, wanting proper, respectful funerals untainted by the Montgomerys' touch. Each year on the anniversary of the Montgomerys' arrest, a small ceremony is held at this special section of the cemetery. No speeches are made, no names are read aloud. The participants, fewer each year as the direct memory of the events fades, simply place white flowers on each grave and stand in silence for a moment before departing. The ceremony ends with the caretaker locking the wrought iron gates of the cemetery as dusk falls. According to local tradition, he checks each lock twice, a practice that began with the first caretaker after the Montgomery case and has been maintained by each successor. When asked why, the current caretaker, whose grandfather held the position in 1920, gives the same answer that has been passed down through generations. Some things once freed must be carefully contained. Some memories once disturbed must be properly laid to rest. And some doors, once opened, must be doubly secured, lest what waits beyond them finds another way in. Yet perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Montgomery case lies not in the couple's crimes themselves, but in the influence they may have had on others in their profession. In 1957, a funeral director in Maine was arrested after complaints from families who noticed unusual alterations to their deceased loved ones. While the case never went to trial, the accused took his own life before proceedings could begin. Investigators discovered a hidden collection of books and articles about the Montgomery case among his effects. Similarly, in 1962, 2 mortuary students at a Boston technical college were expelled after presenting what their professor described as highly inappropriate modifications to cadavers during their final practical examination. Both reportedly expressed admiration for the technical innovations of the Montgomerys, though they denied any intention to emulate their crimes. These incidents, while isolated, raise the unsettling possibility that the Montgomerys' artistic vision did not die with them, but continues to exert a subtle influence on those drawn to both death work and artistic expression, an underground current in the funeral industry that occasionally surfaces in troubling ways. As for the photographs that started it all, those macabre portraits of the dead transformed, most were destroyed as ordered by the court, but persistent rumors suggest that not all met this fate. Vermont antiquarians occasionally whisper about private collections containing what are euphemistically called Montgomery studies. Whether these are authentic or merely clever forgeries created to capitalize on the notorious case remains unverified. What we know for certain is that in 1967, during the renovation of an old house in Burlington that had once belonged to the court clerk from the Montgomery trial, workers discovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall cavity. According to the contractor's sworn statement, the box contained several photographs that matched descriptions of the Montgomerys' work. Before authorities could secure these items, they allegedly disappeared from the worksite. 1 year later, an anonymous donor contributed funds to the Vermont Historical Society for the establishment of a sealed archive dedicated to documenting criminal innovation in the early 20th century. The donor specified that the archive remain sealed until 2020, a century after the Montgomery case. Whether this archive contains the missing photographs is a matter of speculation that will remain unresolved for those of us alive today. The most persistent question surrounding the Montgomery case, one that continues to haunt researchers and fascinate the morbidly curious, is how and where the couple developed their unique methods. Nothing in their known backgrounds explains their technical expertise or their particular aesthetic vision. Sutton's official history showed only a standard apprenticeship with a conventional funeral director in Hartford, Connecticut. Vivian had no formal training in mortuary science at all, listing her previous occupation as photographer's assistant on their marriage certificate from 1910. Yet, the techniques they employed in Oakville required sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, anatomy, and preservation methods far beyond standard embalming practices of the era. The substances found in their workroom, analyzed by chemists from the University of Vermont in 1921, included compounds that were not commonly available, and preservation methods that one expert described as at least 20 years ahead of current mortuary science. This incongruity has led some researchers to propose theories about possible mentors or collaborators who might have initiated the Montgomerys into their macabre art form. Dr. Cahill, in his 1967 paper, suggested the possibility of an underground network of like-minded individuals experimenting with post-mortem modifications that might have existed in the early 20th century, pointing to similar cases in Europe, particularly in Germany and Austria between 1890 and 1910. The question of who taught the Montgomerys, or whether they developed their techniques independently through experimentation, remains unanswered. But perhaps even more disturbing is the question of who they might have taught during their years of operation. In her interview with Dr. Hargrove, Vivian hinted at this possibility. When asked if she and Sutton were unique in their approach to mortuary arts, she reportedly laughed softly and replied, "Art movements require disciples, Doctor. The Renaissance didn't end with Da Vinci, and our vision won't end with us." The implication that the Montgomerys may have shared their techniques with others, creating a legacy that could resurface anywhere funeral homes operate, continues to disturb those who study their case. Despite extensive investigation, No concrete evidence of such disciples has ever been discovered, but the possibility remains a shadowy footnote to an already disturbing chapter of criminal history. Another facet of the Montgomery case that has received relatively little attention is the role played by the small-town setting in which their crimes unfolded. Oakville, with its population of less than 1,000, represented the ideal environment for the Montgomerys' activities, close-knit enough to provide a steady supply of subjects, yet isolated enough to avoid the scrutiny that might have come in a larger community. Small towns operate on trust, observed sociologist Dr. Frances Weber in her 1966 analysis of the case. Residents know each other well enough that credentials are often less important than personal connections. Once accepted, newcomers like the Montgomerys can operate with minimal oversight, particularly in professions that most people are reluctant to examine too closely. This dynamic was exacerbated by the historical period. In 1919-1920, Oakville, like many American communities, was still reeling from the dual traumas of World War I and the influenza pandemic. Death had become a familiar presence, and residents were perhaps less inclined to question the details of funeral practices during a time when mortality rates were already elevated. The Montgomerys exploited a community in mourning, Dr. Weber wrote. They recognized that grief makes people vulnerable, less likely to question, more willing to accept comforting illusions. In a sense, they weaponized the very trust that small-town funeral directors typically enjoy. The physical layout of the Montgomery funeral home itself contributed to their ability to conduct their activities undetected. According to architectural plans discovered during the investigation, the Montgomerys had made significant modifications to the building shortly after purchasing it, including the installation of soundproofing materials in the walls of the preparation room and the construction of the hidden sub-basement. The building was designed to conceal, noted Dr. Reynolds in a 1952 interview for the Vermont Quarterly. The layout created natural boundaries between public and private spaces, with the preparation room and darkroom positioned to ensure maximum privacy. Even the placement of windows, small, high, and heavily curtained, suggests a deliberate strategy to prevent casual observation. This architectural secrecy extended to the Montgomerys' living quarters as well. The second floor of the funeral home, where the couple resided, was divided into two distinct sections: a conventional living area that could be shown to visitors, and a private study, accessible only through a hidden door disguised as a bookcase. This study, discovered during the sheriff's raid, contained the couple's personal journals, technical manuals, and a collection of anatomical drawings that revealed the evolution of their art form. The study was a window into their minds, Sheriff Sullivan reportedly told a colleague, according to notes discovered in 1966. Everything was meticulously organized: drawings, photographs, technical diagrams. There was a coldness to it all, a clinical precision that was somehow more disturbing than if it had been chaotic. They weren't deranged in any conventional sense. They were methodical, purposeful. This methodical approach extended to their selection of subjects. Analysis of the Montgomerys' records, conducted by the FBI in 1960 as part of a broader study of unusual criminal patterns, revealed that they did not choose their specimens randomly. They appeared to have criteria, physical characteristics that they believed offered the greatest potential for their particular form of enhancement. They favored certain features, the FBI report noted: high cheekbones, long fingers, graceful proportions. In some cases, they seem to have actively sought out specific physical types, offering discounted services to families whose deceased members possessed the qualities they desired. This selective approach helps explain why certain bodies received the full transformation treatment, while others were handled in a more conventional manner. It also suggests a level of premeditation that contradicts early theories that the Montgomerys might have stumbled into their crimes through gradual boundary violations in their professional practice. These weren't crimes of opportunity, wrote criminologist Howard Matthews in his 1964 analysis. The Montgomerys arrived in Oakville with a clear vision of what they intended to do. Every aspect of their operation, from the building modifications to their business practices, was designed to facilitate their true purpose. The funeral business wasn't their profession, it was their cover. The couple's background before arriving in Oakville has been the subject of extensive investigation, though significant gaps remain. Records show that Sutton Montgomery was born in 1882 in western Massachusetts to a family of modest means. His father was a cabinet maker specializing in furniture for the funeral industry, coffins, viewing tables, and display cases, which may explain Sutton's early exposure to mortuary practices. Vivian's origins are more obscure. The name she used in Oakville, Vivian Lockridge Montgomery, first appears in records in 1910 when she married Sutton in a small ceremony in New Hampshire. No birth certificate or earlier records have ever been located, leading some researchers to speculate that Vivian Lockridge may have been an assumed identity. The absence of records is telling. Kierstad noted genealogist Margaret Hayes in a 1967 article for the New England Historical Society Journal. In that era, for a woman to have no traceable history, no birth certificate, school records, or census entries, suggests a deliberate effort to obscure her past. The question is, what was she hiding? One theory proposed by Dr. Cahill in his comprehensive 1967 study of the case is that Vivian may have had training in medical illustration or anatomical modeling in Europe before meeting Sutton. This would explain both her technical skills and the European influences evident in the Montgomerys' aesthetic approach to their subjects. Certain techniques used by the Montgomerys, particularly in their facial reconstructions, bear striking similarities to methods developed in Vienna and Berlin during the early 1900s, Dr. Cahill wrote. These were not techniques that would have been available through standard American mortuary training of the period. This European connection is supported by entries in Sutton's journal referring to V's continental methods and techniques perfected in the Old World. However, no concrete evidence has ever emerged to confirm Vivian's presence in Europe or any formal training she might have received there. The Montgomerys' activities in the years between their marriage in 1910 and their arrival in Oakville in 1919 have been partially reconstructed through business records, property deeds, and local newspaper archives. During this period, they operated funeral homes under various names in 4 locations: Lakeville, Connecticut, 1912-1914, Tarrytown, New York, 1914-1916, Bedford, New Hampshire, 1916-1917, and briefly in Rockport, Massachusetts, 1917-1919. In each community, they followed a similar pattern, purchasing an existing funeral business, operating it for approximately 2 years, then selling the property and moving on. Public records indicate that they were well regarded in these communities, with no complaints or suspicious incidents reported during their tenure. However, given what was later discovered in Oakville, researchers have naturally questioned whether their earlier operations might have included similar activities that went undetected. The mobility itself is suspicious, noted FBI analyst Robert Turner in the 1960 report. Operating a successful funeral home typically relies on community integration and long-term relationship building. The Montgomerys' pattern of frequent relocation runs counter to standard business practices in the industry and suggests they may have moved whenever they felt their true activities risked exposure. Efforts to investigate the Montgomerys' previous properties have yielded few results. In most cases, the buildings were significantly altered or demolished by subsequent owners long before authorities became interested in examining them. The Tarrytown location was destroyed in a fire in 1922, while the Bedford property was converted into a medical clinic in 1925. with extensive renovations that would have eliminated any hidden spaces or structural modifications. Only the Rockport location remained relatively intact when investigated in 1965. Authorities discovered a sealed room in the basement that appeared to have been used as a photography studio, with evidence of specialized lighting fixtures and darkroom equipment having been installed and later removed. However, no physical evidence of preserved remains or photographic records was found. The investigation into the Montgomerys' earlier activities was further complicated by the death of key witnesses. By the time authorities began seriously investigating their previous locations in the 1960s, many of those who had known the couple during their earlier operations had died or relocated. Those who remained often had only vague memories of the quiet, professional undertakers who had briefly served their communities decades earlier. One exception was Dr. Samuel Whitaker, who had served as the town physician in Bedford during the Montgomerys' time there. In a sworn statement given in 1964, he recalled an incident that had struck him as unusual but not alarming at the time. "I was called to the funeral home one evening in the winter of 1917 to sign a death certificate for an elderly man who had died at home. When I arrived, I found Mr. Montgomery working late in the preparation room. Nothing unusual about that, but I noticed he had an unusual array of instruments laid out, tools that seemed more appropriate for sculpture than embalming. When I inquired, he explained they were specialized tools for facial reconstruction, necessary due to the deceased having suffered severe facial injuries in a fall. I accepted this explanation at the time, but in retrospect, given what we now know, I wonder if I witnessed something more sinister. Such testimonies, while suggestive, provided insufficient evidence for authorities to definitively establish that the Montgomerys had engaged in their unusual practices before their arrival in Oakville. The mystery of their earlier activities remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding the case. The psychological impact of the Montgomery case on the community of Oakville was profound and long-lasting. Dr. Eliza Thornton, a psychologist who conducted interviews with Oakville residents in 1955 as part of a study on community trauma, documented what she called a persistent undercurrent of anxiety that continued to affect the town decades after the events. The violation was not just of the dead, but of the community's trust, Dr. Thornton wrote in her findings, published in the Journal of Community Psychology in 1956. Residents described a lingering sense of betrayal, the feeling that they had welcomed and trusted individuals who had used that trust to commit unspeakable acts right under their noses. This betrayal was particularly acute for those whose family members had been handled by the Montgomerys. The uncertainty about which deceased had been treated respectfully and which had been subjected to the couple's artistic alterations created what Dr. Thornton called ambiguous grief, a condition where the normal process of mourning is complicated by unanswerable questions. Not knowing became its own torment, she wrote. Many families chose to exhume and rebury their loved ones rather than live with the uncertainty, but even this provided incomplete closure. The question remained: what had been done before the reburial? What changes had been made that might never be undone? The dead had been violated, and by extension, so had the living who loved them. The town's collective response to this trauma manifested in various ways. Most notably, Oakville developed what sociologists have identified as a culture of vigilance, a heightened sensitivity to outsiders and unusual behaviors that persisted for generations. Town records show that between 1921 and 1950, Oakville rejected numerous applications from professionals seeking to establish businesses in the community, particularly those in medical or death-related fields. The town became insular, noted local historian Bennett in his 1955 article. New residents were subjected to a level of scrutiny that bordered on hostility. It wasn't enough to have credentials and references. Newcomers had to prove themselves trustworthy through years of observed behavior, before being fully accepted. This insularity contributed to Oakvale's economic decline in the decades following the Montgomery case. While surrounding communities embraced new industries and experienced growth during the post-war period, Oakvale remained static, its population gradually decreasing as younger residents left for more welcoming environments. By 1960, the town had developed a reputation throughout Vermont as a place that didn't like strangers, a characterization that further deterred potential residents and businesses. Only in the late 1960s, as the generation with direct memory of the events began to fade, did the community slowly begin to open itself to outside influences again. The psychological impact extended to funeral practices as well. For decades after the Montgomery case, Oakvale residents showed a marked preference for home funerals rather than using professional services. When professional services were required, families typically chose funeral homes in neighboring towns, even when this meant considerable inconvenience and expense. The first funeral home to successfully establish itself in Oakvale after the Montgomery case did not open until 1952, more than 30 years after the events. Its owner, Harold Jenkins, no relation to the Montgomery's assistant, took extraordinary measures to gain the community's trust, including offering completely transparent operations where family members could observe every step of the preparation process. "I understand their fears," Jenkins told the Oakville Gazette in a 1952 interview. "I'm not here to ask them to forget what happened. I'm here to show them that it's possible to care for their dead with dignity and respect. Every door in my establishment is unlocked. Every procedure is open to observation. I have nothing to hide, because I do nothing that requires hiding." This transparency eventually won over the community, though Jenkins reported that even into the 1960s, some older residents refused to use his services, preferring to handle funeral arrangements privately rather than trust another professional with their loved ones. The Montgomery case has continued to exert a cultural influence far beyond the borders of Oakvale. In academic circles, it is studied as a unique example of what criminologists call aesthetic criminality, illegal acts motivated not by financial gain, sexual gratification, or anger, but by a perverted artistic vision. "The Montgomerys represent a rare category of offender," wrote Dr. Leonard Pratt in his 1968 textbook, Criminal Psychology, A Modern Approach. "They committed their crimes not out of passion or for profit, but in service to an aesthetic ideal that most of society finds abhorrent. This disconnect between their self-perception as artists and the public's perception of them as desecrators makes them particularly difficult subjects for rehabilitation." This aspect of the case has made it a recurring point of reference in discussions about the boundaries of art and ethics. The question of whether something can be simultaneously artistically accomplished and morally reprehensible, whether technical skill and aesthetic vision can exist independently of ethical considerations, continues to be debated in philosophy of art courses, often with the Montgomerys serving as an extreme example. In popular culture, while the specifics of the Montgomery case are not widely known outside of Vermont and true crime circles, their influence can be detected in numerous fictional works. Several horror films of the 1960s and 1970s featured Undertaker characters with secret artistic aspirations involving their clients. The 1964 novel The Quiet Ones by Raymond Carter, while never explicitly acknowledged as being inspired by the Montgomerys, features a similar couple operating a funeral home in rural New England who are discovered to have been altering bodies for artistic purposes. More recently, the case has experienced renewed attention through true crime podcasts and documentaries. The 1968 Vermont Public Radio series The Undertaker Artists was one of the first comprehensive examinations of the case available to the general public, and its remastered version became one of the station's most downloaded programs when re-released in 2018. The fascination with the Montgomerys extends beyond their crimes to the philosophical questions their case raises about death, art, and bodily autonomy. The fundamental question, who owns the human body after death, remains relevant in contemporary discussions about funeral practices, organ donation, and the display of human remains in medical and artistic contexts. The Montgomerys violated not just legal boundaries, but cultural taboos that exist across nearly all human societies, noted Dr. Simmons in her final assessment of the case. The proper treatment of the dead is one of our most universal ethical concerns. Yet the disturbing reality is that their technical achievements were substantial. They developed preservation methods that even today's mortuary science would consider innovative. This uncomfortable intersection of technical brilliance and moral depravity is what makes their case so enduringly disturbing. As the centennial of the Montgomery case approaches in 2020, plans for commemorative events in Vermont have generated controversy. Some argue that the case deserves scholarly attention as a significant historical event, with continuing relevance to discussions of professional ethics and community trust. Others contend that such commemorations risk glamorizing the Montgomery's crimes and re-traumatizing the descendants of their victims. The Vermont Historical Society has announced a limited exhibition scheduled for December 2020, focusing on the legal and regulatory changes that emerged in response to the case rather than on the Montgomerys themselves or their work. Whether the sealed archive, established by the anonymous donor in 1968 and specified to remain closed until 2020, will be opened as part of this commemoration remains undetermined. What is certain is that the case of the Undertaker couple continues to haunt our collective imagination precisely because it touches on our deepest fears about death and what happens to us after we die. The vulnerability of the dead, their inability to protect themselves from desecration or misuse, mirrors our own ultimate vulnerability at the end of life. The Montgomerys exploited this vulnerability in service to their twisted aesthetic vision. In doing so, they violated not just the bodies of the dead but the trust of the living who had surrendered those bodies to their care. This double betrayal of both the deceased and those who mourned them represents a violation of the sacred contract that allows communities to function, a contract based on the assumption that professionals will use their specialized knowledge for good rather than harm. The story of the Undertaker, couple of 1920, serves as a disturbing reminder of how easily the boundary between professional care and artistic obsession can blur when human remains become objects of fascination rather than vessels deserving dignity. It raises uncomfortable questions about our cultural relationship with death and the trust we place in those who handle our loved ones in their most vulnerable state. Perhaps most unsettling is the thought that lingered in the minds of Oakville residents for decades after the case was closed. How many other funeral homes in how many other small towns might harbor similar secrets? How many other practitioners view the dead not as sacred charges to be respected, but as raw material for private artistic expression? And how would we know until it was too late? As you reflect on this documented case, consider this final, disquieting detail. When Sutton Montgomery died in prison in 1943, his body was cremated as specified by court order to prevent any possibility of his remains being preserved through his own methods. Yet when authorities came to collect Vivian Montgomery's body after her death in 1961, the hospital staff reported a peculiar observation. Her hands, which had been gnarled by arthritis in her final years, appeared at the moment of death to have temporarily regained the elegant, elongated appearance that witnesses had described seeing on her perfected subjects. The attending physician dismissed this as a trick of light and shadow. But the night nurse, in a private letter discovered among her effects after her own passing in 1968, wrote, "I have seen many deaths in my career. I know the changes that come over the human form when life departs. What I witnessed with Mrs. Montgomery was something else entirely. For a moment, just a moment, her hands weren't her own. They belonged to something trying to emerge from within her, something that had waited patiently all those years, something that understood, as she had, that death is not an end but a transformation. In the end, the legacy of the Montgomery case extends far beyond the borders of Oakville or the specific crimes committed there. It serves as a dark mirror reflecting our collective anxieties about death, art, and the limits of professional trust. The Undertaker's role has always existed at the uncomfortable intersection between the living and the dead, between science and ritual, between body and spirit. The Montgomerys exploited that intersection for their own purposes, turning what should have been a sacred duty into an opportunity for personal artistic expression. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most disturbing monsters are not supernatural creatures lurking in the shadows, but ordinary humans who see the world through a lens so distorted that acts of desecration appear to them as acts of creation. The quiet horror of the Montgomery case lies not in gore or violence, but in the cold, meticulous perversion of care into exploitation. A reminder that true darkness often hides behind the most respectable facades, waiting for the opportunity to transform what we love into something unrecognizable.